Amina moved slowly through the station, her wheelchair gliding with ease on the smooth floor. She was used to furtive glances, barely concealed whispers, silent prejudices. Being a black woman with a disability often meant facing double discrimination. But today, she didn't pay attention to the passers-by. Her mind was focused on the lecture she was to give at the university, an important event where she was to address the rights of people with disabilities and police violence. She was dressed soberly, an elegant navy blue suit and a silk scarf tied around her neck. Her purse sat on her lap, containing important documents and her cell phone. She was walking towards the platform when she heard a dry voice echo behind her. "Hey, ma'am, stop immediately." The voice cracked like a whip in the charged air of the station, reverberating between the concrete walls. Amina stopped abruptly. She turned slowly in her wheelchair, her hands placed firmly on the armrests, her impassive face masking the tension that was beginning to emerge within her. Two police officers were approaching quickly. One was tall, blonde, with a sharp face and a piercing gaze of mechanical coldness. The other, stockier, brown, his face closed like a locked door, moved slightly behind, scrutinizing Amina with undisguised suspicion. "Your papers, right away," ordered the blonde in a dry tone, without even a sign of politeness. Amina frowned slightly. There had been no incident or commotion. Why her? The answer crossed her mind before she could even formulate the question. She had seen it too often to still be surprised. Taking a deep breath to calm the rising frustration, she replied in a measured voice. "Why are you asking me for my papers?" His voice was calm, but each word was a silent act of resistance. The blonde policeman stepped forward abruptly, leaning slightly towards her, his shadow covering part of his face. "Don't ask questions and obey. This is a routine check." A cold shiver ran down Amina's spine. She knew what these words meant. Routine check. A hollow term, a smokescreen behind which arbitrariness was hidden. A pretext. A way of giving a legal facade to injustice. Despite the dull rage that boiled inside her, Amina remained calm. She slowly opened her purse, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from suppressed anger. She held out her ID card. The dark-haired policeman grabbed it abruptly, his fingers brushing her hand roughly, as if it were just an object, an unimportant formality. He narrowed his eyes as he examined the map. "Are you traveling alone? Where are you going?" he asked, his voice thick with barely veiled contempt. Amina took a deep breath, smoothing the wrinkles of her crumpled dignity with an invisible hand. "I'm going to a conference." The blonde burst out with a dry laugh, without any trace of humor. "A conference?" he repeated with a mocking grin. "Which conference?" The tone used was not that of an agent seeking information, but that of an accuser convinced in advance. Amina felt the humiliation creeping into her, insidious, familiar. But she knew that the worst defeat would be to let herself be broken. Then she raised her head, her eyes fixed on those of the blonde police officer. "A conference on human rights." The policeman's laughter resonated again, louder, attracting the attention of several passers-by. Some stopped, pretending to be interested in something else, while others observed the scene with curiosity. A woman discreetly took out her phone and started filming. "Really?" sneered the blonde policeman. "Since when does a disabled person travel alone for these kinds of events?" A heavy silence fell. The words crashed like stones to the ground, heavy with contempt. Amina felt her muscles tense. His heart was beating hard, not from fear, but from rage. She knew she was being judged, not for what she had done, but for what she represented, a black woman in a wheelchair, in a space where her simple presence seemed disturbing. "Open your bag." His voice had become harsher, more authoritarian. "I refuse," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "You have no valid reason to search me." The dark-haired policeman clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing. "Don't complicate things. If you have nothing to hide, open your bag." If you have nothing to hide. This sentence resonated in Amina's mind. The eternal argument of oppressors to justify the unjustifiable. She knew she had rights. She knew the law better than most people. But she also knew that in times like this, rights were words on paper, fragile in the face of abuse of power. Then, with calculated slowness, she opened her bag. The blonde policeman plunged his hand in without the slightest consideration, going through his personal belongings, crumpling up documents, casting a disdainful glance at everything he found. He pulled out a file, flipping through it quickly before raising an eyebrow. "What is this?" "My notes for the conference." The blonde police officer rolled the file between his fingers, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Yeah, sure." He cast a knowing look at his colleague, a glint of contempt in his eyes. "I've seen this kind of scheme before. People who pretend to be speakers or lawyers to avoid scrutiny." The words, dripping with condescension, sounded like a slap. Amina felt the familiar heat of anger rising within her, the anger she had learned to control, to contain behind years of professionalism and resilience. "Do you realize the absurdity of what you are saying?" she replied, her voice trembling not with fear, but with indignation. She straightened her chest slightly, despite the tension that tightened her muscles. "You are harassing me because I am a black woman in a wheelchair, and you refuse to accept that I am anything other than a suspect in your eyes." A tense silence ensued. The dark-haired policeman approached, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. His breath smelled of cold coffee and arrogance. "You're the one playing the victim, ma'am." His voice was a whisper, cold and smug. "Aren't you taking advantage of your situation?" Amina felt her heart thumping hard against her chest. His fists clenched on the armrests of his chair. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to him like this, but the public humiliation had a bitter, burning taste. Around them, passers-by formed an invisible circle, between curiosity and indifference, some lowering their eyes, others discreetly raising their phones to film. Just as she was about to respond, a deep voice cut through the air. "What is happening here?" The policemen froze, stiff as statues. Amina turned her head. A tall man strode forward, his perfectly tailored suit emphasizing his natural authority. His face was closed, his eyes glinting with barely contained anger. The whispers spread like wildfire among the crowd. "It's the Minister of Justice." The two police officers instantly turned pale. "Mr. Minister, we were doing a simple routine check," stammered the blonde, suddenly less sure of himself. The minister did not even deign to answer them. He stopped in front of Amina, kneeling slightly to come to her level. His hand rested on her shoulder with respectful gentleness, in violent contrast to the aggression she had just suffered. "Madam Sao, I am deeply sorry for this shameful scene." His voice was low but firm, laced with controlled anger. The police officers exchanged panicked looks. "Madame Sao," the brunette repeated, his voice almost inaudible. The minister straightened up, his gaze becoming a sharp icicle. "Yes, Amina, so you know, the winner of the International Human Rights Prize. One of the greatest lawyers in our country." Shock was visible on both agents' faces, their arrogance crumbling in an instant. We didn't know." The blonde policeman tried to justify, his voice trembling. But Amina raised a hand to interrupt him. His gaze, hard and piercing, swept over the two men. "That's the problem. You treat people with contempt without even knowing who they are." She paused, letting her words sink into the tense air. "But the important thing is not my status. The bottom line is that you would have done the same thing to any other black woman in a wheelchair. And that is unacceptable." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. The phones continued to film, capturing every word, every expression. The minister turned to the police, his voice cutting like a blade. "You are suspended from now on. An investigation will be opened to determine the extent of your abuse." The agents stood frozen, unable to respond. A few hours later, the video made the rounds on social networks. The indignation was immediate. Hashtags denouncing abuses of power and systemic racism went viral. Public figures, activists and ordinary citizens spoke out in support of Amina and demanding reforms. A few days later, the government announced a reform of abusive police checks. An independent commission was created to investigate discriminatory practices within law enforcement. As for the two police officers, they were officially suspended, awaiting disciplinary sanctions. But for Amina, this victory was not personal. She was just one more step in a fight she had always been waging. A fight so that every person, famous or unknown, rich or poor, disabled or not, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. And that day, on this ordinary sidewalk, under the gaze of passers-by and cameras, Amina Sow had transformed humiliation into an act of resistance.